You can hear me? Okay, good. I just want to make sure I wasn't muted. Uh, Good morning, everybody. My name is Javed Siddiqui. I have the good fortune of serving as the president of the Hunt Institute. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to in particular thank Governor Wise and Governor Perdue for taking time to share your insights. I know how busy all of you are during this time, so we appreciate you taking the opportunity to be with us, especially now as states are working hard to support students and families as distance learning continues across the country and likely for the foreseeable future in many instances. The Institute has been fortunate enough to build relationships with a number of state leaders over the years, and these two former governors with us today are close friends of the Institute, and we continue to be appreciative of the work they are supporting with us and the work they are supporting on their own in their own endeavors. This is the first webinar in our new series featuring the voices of and perspectives of former governors. The work that these leaders have done and continue to do in their states is important and impactful. And we look forward to hearing how lessons they've learned while in office can push us to work better and harder to improve education across the country. So thank you again for all that you do. I would now like to introduce Romney Drucker from the Walton Family Foundation, who will serve as our moderator today. Romney is the Deputy Director for K-12 Education Program at the Walton Family Foundation. In this role, she oversees team operations and the grant-making strategy. Prior to joining the foundation, Romney was the co-founder and CEO of the 74, an award-winning nonprofit news organization focused on education. Coincidentally, Governor Wise just placed an op-ed related to this discussion with the 74 in the past couple of weeks. So thank you, Romney, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you to get our conversation going.
Thank you so much, Javed, and thank you to the Hunt Institute, to Governor Perdue and Governor Wise for having me here today. I'm Romney Drucker, Deputy Director of the K-12 Education Program at the Walton Family Foundation, a family-led foundation that for over 3 decades has worked to help create access and opportunity for children by investing in education and also in the environment and in America's heartland. Today's discussion on closing the digital divide may be among the least controversial and most important conversations I facilitated. New research from Common Sense Media shows that between 15 and 16 million school children across the US live in households without adequate internet access or devices to facilitate remote learning. And as many as 400,000 teachers lack adequate internet or computing devices at home. We knew before COVID-19 that far too many students in this country weren't getting the education they deserved because of systemic barriers to learning. And now, a public health crisis has created the most significant education crisis our nation has ever faced. But the fact is, there is widespread agreement about the urgency of closing the digital divide, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about that today. Just a couple of facts. Some polling conducted by Frank Luntz quite recently noted that 77% of voters believe that every student should have access to high quality, reliable, high-speed internet at home. Another poll conducted by Echelon Insights affirms that there is broad support for providing connectivity to students. Over 70% believe it is, quote, imperative. And there is growing bipartisan support for action in Congress, but thus far, no solution. And so what's needed now is momentum and real leadership across sectors. That's why I'm very excited to be here today with the Hunt Institute and 2 incredible leaders, Governor Perdue and Governor Wise, to explore the courageous next steps that we need, state and federal leadership, and frankly, leadership in the private sector as well, to be taking to address this challenge. And I just want to mention that it's not just elected leaders who are tackling this issue. And so I want to say thank you on behalf of everyone to the parents and community leaders who have been moving this issue forward, not just during COVID, but for years and years. I'm going to get started by doing a quick introduction of Governor Perdue, who will then give brief introductory remarks, followed by Governor Wise. A former public school teacher, Bev Perdue served as the first female governor of North Carolina from 2009 to 2013. She is the founder of DigiLearn, a nonprofit working to narrow achievement and skills gaps through technology. As governor, she led the transformation of North Carolina's classrooms by investing in innovative EdTech and creating public-private partnerships to fully integrate technology into the state's education system, including North Carolina's statewide broadband education network. In a recent op-ed, she wrote, quote, "Technology is no longer an extra, but an essential to schools and to homes." She has been an important voice on this issue for a long time. Governor Perdue, I'm very excited to hear from you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Romney. I'm delighted to be here with you and the Hunt Institute. And Governor Wise is a dear friend. So thank you all for listening today, our listeners or viewers out there in Etherland. Yeah, I can remember in March, do y'all remember back that far, where we were all happily going about our daily lives, and some of us complained about having to catch a train or a bus or a plane or blah, blah, blah. Well, overnight our world shifted and we found ourselves in the era of a pandemic, the first time for all of us almost. And it was just a huge transition, both personally, professionally, and family-wise across the world, not just the country. So we as individuals and citizens had to adapt. We had to pivot. We had to change the way we did things. And so we found ourselves not only being at home, cooking at home, eating at home, we found ourselves working at home economically, our jobs, and also educating our children and grandchildren at home. And so right then, folks in America began to see education is economic development, because I'm having to teach my children while I also have a job. And the big impediment to the success of all of our work is the same common denominator. It's connectivity, it's access to the internet. You know, way back in the 2000s, North Carolina was really lucky. We weren't lucky about the recession of 2007, but we were lucky at the fact that I was the governor and I had a team around me who understood somehow the importance of connectivity in the internet. So when we went to Washington to beg for federal funds, we took hundreds of millions of dollars from them and invested it across our state in technology and infrastructure. And when all this happened, the schools were fine, Romney. The schools' technology worked. But in North Carolina, you had all these children at home trying to learn and trying to succeed, with teachers who had to pivot overnight from traditional classroom teaching to being a master virtual teacher. That doesn't come easy for the teacher, the parent, nor the child. But as we began to dig deeper, I thought, well, North Carolina is going to be the star of how you educate through virtual technology initially. And then I began to hear the horror stories about children who live in rural counties, children who live in communities that may have a little bit of internet, but that aren't highly sophisticatedly wired or have access to a satellite or some kind of broadband. And then I began to hear the numbers. In North Carolina, we have about 1.7 million kids, and about a third of those children either don't have a device or they don't have access, the connectivity. And sometimes the school stepped in and gave kids devices, but the kid took it home to a home that didn't have connectivity. And we've tried the hotspots all over America. Well, you find me a 13-year-old in America who's willing to go down to the bus stop or the shopping center and stand somehow next to whoever the hotspot is. Those hotspots work a little bit, but not well. And so today, the conversation that we're about to have is critically important, not just to our educational system, but our economy. We have to step up as a society, as a people, and lay down or put in the sky whatever it takes to fund and to set up infrastructure. You know, I'm from the rural part of North Carolina, and I've heard stories about the Rural Electric Authority way back when, in the 30s. The country in the 30s stood up and said, we are going to pay as a citizenry for electricity so that everybody in America can have access to electric lights and power. It's time in the 21st century that we, the millennials and the old people like me, do the same thing. We have got to urge and beg and plead and maybe mandate our elected leaders that this is where the federal government must step in some kind of partnership with the states to lay down access to connectivity and technology. It's not just for education, it's for the economy. Businesses cannot thrive in this kind of climate without infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Governor Perdue, and I'm looking forward to following up on your opening comments in just a moment. I'd like to quickly introduce Governor Wise, who I think Governor Perdue and I agree have the best Zoom background on this webinar, among other attributes. So former Governor Bob Wise has spent his career advancing education opportunities for our nation's students, and we're thrilled to have him with us here today. He recently completed 14 years as president of the Alliance for Excellent Education and has been a national leader in advocating for the policies and practices necessary for secondary school students to be ready for post-secondary education and fulfilling careers. Governor Wise also led the development of Future Ready Schools, a network of 3,300 school districts committed to assisting teachers and improving student learning outcomes through digital learning. He is currently a senior fellow at FutureEd, and Governor Wise, we're thrilled to have your voice in this conversation, so I'd invite you to also make some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for a conversation.
Thank you, Romy, and thank you very much to the Hunt Institute for all the work it's been doing in advancing this issue, and to Governor Perdue, who is my rock star in terms of how you get a state to adopt policy and effectively implement to the level that she has. And she points out the shortcomings, and I think that's important. And Romy, since you pointed out my backdrop, I'm actually, because Governor Perdue has done such incredible work as governor, I'm going to go back to before when I was governor. I actually spent 18 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so I'd like to talk some about that federal role and partnership that Governor Perdue referenced. First of all, let's remember that what happened in February, and then when almost every child went home, it was a pandemic. It was actually a trifecta, because we got hit by a pandemic. We had an immediate economic decline with up to, at that time, 30 million people out of work. And also COVID laid bare the great concerns around equity. So equity, economics, and education all coming to a collision and at once. And COVID did not, in somebody much smarter than I observed this, COVID did not change the way we did things, but what it did was force us to accelerate. And so we went from having somewhere around 10% of students engaged in some level of blended or distance learning to, within 2 weeks, 100%. And every educator, 3.2 million teachers, 105,000 public schools, 14,000 school districts, and so on, every educator having to make the same adjustments. So it's an incredible time. Romy, you mentioned, and Governor Perdue, some of the statistics, but I think there are a couple of others that are important. Low-income students, 1 out of 4 are highly unlikely to have any kind of access. Also, while that number may say that some of those students do have a device, they have a cell phone. Try doing your homework, try filling out a FAFSA form, try doing a lot of the other work that's so essential in that regard. And one of the stunning numbers is that it's been estimated in April about 47% of students were not attending class. And I think that not having digital access is a very large contributing factor. Governor Perdue referenced the success in getting to schools, and she led the state effort to do that, and she also carefully strategically used federal funds, and she used a lot of E-rate dollars. And at the federal level, I would say that the E-rate has been fairly successful in reaching the goal that it set several years ago, the Federal Communications Commission, of 99 in 5, 99% of classrooms with broadband access in 5 years. That's the good news. As Governor Perdue and you have pointed out, though, it's getting it home. It's when the child gets on that school bus, and whether they're going 3 blocks away or they're going 30 miles away in a rural area, having that access. And I also want to point out, Romy, that this is now mushroomed into far more than just an education issue, because without that broadband access, yes, there's a homework gap that FCC Commissioner Rosenworcel refers to. Yes, there's a homework gap, but there's also the gap in being able to do all the other things related to education. Once again, filling out those college application forms, filling out the FAFSA forms, getting school counseling. There are parents that are trying to apply for desperately needed social services, including unemployment. benefits. There's the need for, if you are able to if you still have a job, there's a need to be able to work from home in that job. And we're also seeing an incredible explosion in healthcare being delivered via the internet. You have consultations with physicians and other healthcare professionals. So this is now more than just education. This is all about the basic supply, the basic services that we all depend upon, and not the least of which is e-commerce. I've been focusing a lot on the stimulus package and the need for this to be in the stimulus package. But I think we ought to remember, stimulus package for the most part is about helping people maintain the situation they're in, so that they're not worse, and that when this ends, they're able to move forward. This to me is more than simply maintaining. This is an investment in the future of the country. Economic growth only happens when people are, when our economy, our workforce becomes more productive. And so there will not be an increase in productivity unless we have this kind of broadband access and internet access and devices for every family. And I just want to, as Governor Perdue referenced the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration back in the 30s, I want on record I was not there for it. But I do think it's important to note that the Congress, the government, the federal government has stepped up in a number of areas. Our railroads were built across the country with large federal support. We were electrified. Electrification came because of federal support. The highway program, particularly the interstate highway program that started under President Eisenhower in the 50s, that was a federal initiative. And so this is now every bit as necessary and vital as any of those were. And so that's why I think that, yes, I want to see the money hopefully in another stimulus package, but regardless of where it comes from, this investment is critically important for students, even more importantly for the students and their families.
Thank you so much, Governor Wise. I'm excited to get into the conversation now, and just a public announcement that if the audience would like to submit questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to do so. I've seen a couple of questions come in already, so please send through your questions. We definitely want to make sure we get to those. Governor Perdue, I want to go back to what you were talking about with respect to national infrastructure. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about sort of this building? I mean, you use the words urge and beg and plead and mandate when it comes to laying down access to connectivity. What does federal support for national infrastructure look like, and what does that mean?
Thank you, Romney. The definition of infrastructure is critically important to all of us. For years, I ran for office at a local level saying, I promise you that we'll have a highway to here, or we'll have a bridge fixed, or we'll have schools. Infrastructure are the basic services that folks in the country need to survive and to thrive. So I'm talking water, electricity, sewer, roads, police protection, the infrastructure. I tried to change the definition in North Carolina back when I was in the legislature of infrastructure to include technology. I think it is essential to the lifeblood of this country and to every citizen in the country, as is any of the other components of infrastructure. And so what do I mean? I mean that we go to the Congress and we say, as Bob and them ready, time after time, the federal government has stepped up to be partners with the people and with the states in laying down infrastructure investments. And in this century, infrastructure is nothing but access to connectivity in whatever form that might take. It's essential for education, but I believe that probably the more successful way to sell it is to convince the Congress and people across the country that technology is essential to the economy. We are billions of dollars in the hole because of the work we can't do at home. That could be prevented with technology.
And on that point of the cost, thank you, Governor Perdue, because the bill that one of the pieces of legislation suggests $4 billion initially. And whether it's 4 or 6 that's necessary, let's put that in scope. The last stimulus package that passed was the major stimulus package was $2.2 trillion, and it had very few dollars in it for any kind of digital infrastructure. The one that's being considered is somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, trillion, that's with a T, with almost no money in it for this kind of infrastructure. So $4 billion, I don't want to make light of $4 billion, but in the scale of what is being talked about, as someone once said, it's budget dust. It's a very light amount of money. Someone else said you could blow that much off the tax code of the federal government and get that. And so this one is doable. And I understand, don't always agree with, but I understand some of the arguments on other aspects of the stimulus package. I don't understand any disagreement on this one.
Governor Wise, you said in your opening remarks that equity, economics, and education are all coming to a collision. And I hear you and Governor Perdue framing the issue fairly similarly. What is something broken about our coalition that this issue is not being advanced? Like, what is the imminent pressure that we can be putting on the Congress and that state leaders and community leaders need to be? Is there a shift in the message? Is there a shift in tactics that we need to be pursuing? What's going to get us across the finish line here from your perspective?
So I think the push of the pandemic and the economic decline, but that coupled with, as you point out, Romney, that coupled with a couple of additional arguments. The additional arguments are, namely, that we have all now looked, and we are the future. We're living in the future. And the future is that technology has to be will be a much greater part of education, even when we resume, hopefully sometime soon, hopefully children are able to be back in school. But I look, for instance, at, but by the same token, every legislator, every member of Congress has been participating in countless Zoom meetings. That's in video conferences. That's not going to end. We have made a quantum shift in how we operate. And so the ability of everyone to participate is going to depend upon that. For instance, this isn't just about students. This is about the ability of teachers, for instance, to be involved in professional learning communities about distance learning. It's about, for instance, the National School Board Association and its 14,000 districts. It's about the NSBA and being able to, and its districts being able to share experiences with one another. It's about us being able to truly come together much more to adapt to this. And so I think helping the Congress to understand it, I've been working in a couple of states with organizations, urging them to convene meetings with their school leaders, their teachers, video conferences with the representatives, because nobody's been able to travel, so everyone understands fully what are the conditions. If somebody's not sitting at home with that child right now, helping them, trying to help them get adjusted to distance learning, they may not fully appreciate what it is that millions of parents are going through, millions of constituents are experiencing.
Romney, if I may, it's the world. The world has shifted beneath our feet. And none of us initially, I did, because I was scholared in that area around technology. But for the most part, national and state leaders didn't have a priority around technology, because the telecoms are the big companies, the big, huge telecommunications company for your audience. We're so invested, as were the small ones, in their own system that there wasn't any partnership or collaboration. DigiLearn in North Carolina learned early on that there had to be that collaboration. So we pulled people together and had the government invest, but also the telecoms. And that comes from conversation and work. Well, our world has shifted so quickly that we don't have time for a lot of long-term conversations and the building of support. So it takes people like those on the Zoom call today. It takes people like each of us to really take it to the decision makers, take it to those legislators. They have to understand that the people of America are committed to this thing called technology. And that means the definition of infrastructure has to change. Technology is as important as electricity. And we have to be the ones to provide that system, working with the telecoms, whatever way it may show up. For me, the passionate argument, the real way to sell it, is about not just education and not just the jobs of the future of the economy, but also the equity. There is such inequity that's been a crystal light shown during the pandemic on children who come from hard-pressed communities, children who have no support at home, on towns that have no businesses that can run because there is no technology infrastructure. It's the economy and education. And we know for a fact now, every single person in this country knows for a fact that we've got to have it to be competitive in the 21st century. But our kids have to have it to be able to survive and to thrive as the future workers of America.
Romy, if I have one more argument that because it just
I'd love to hear it.
So many. What I'm concerned about is so many political leaders are trying to fight this, who work in this recession like it was the last one, the last Great Recession, 2008 to 2010. And Governor Perdue was governor then and was still able to lead her state through this. But let me talk about that recession. 2008, 2010, worst recession since the Great Depression. There's one major difference here. In 2008, 2010, to my knowledge, not one child was out of school. Flash forward to this one, 50 million K-12 students, 20 million higher education students, almost every teacher, almost principal, and so on. And so we have a total shutdown of the normal operations of our education system, both K-12, pre-K, and higher ed. So that's one major difference. The second major difference is you did not have, you had a lot of people laid off, or unemployed, not to the extent we have on this one. This is even greater, but we did not have so much happening at home, working from home as we do now. So 2008, and the irony to 2008, 2010 is that far more money was advanced in stimulus packages for education and for, I might add, broadband and digital expansion back then when they weren't operating under the pressures that we have today, than has currently been advanced in this recession.
Thank you for that, Governor. I want to talk about the dynamic between affordability and availability in rural and urban areas. We got a question from the audience that says, studies suggest there are 3 times more disconnected people in urban areas where broadband is available but unaffordable. And yet we know that access in rural communities is a significant challenge. From your perspective, how can we ensure that affordability and availability in rural and urban communities is prioritized as part of these discussions? And given your work in your state, what have you seen in terms of some of the different challenge points for different communities?
Well, that situation exists purely and simply. We found that out in the early 2000s, that when you lay it down or work with the telecoms, just because it's there, the family themselves may not have the ability to connect. It's so high. And so we need an effort to work on, again, a partnership, a collaboration with the providers such that there is some kind of equity in rates and some kind of sliding fee scale for people. Again, I point out to the same thing. Of course, we all pay an electric bill if electricity and technology are part of the basic definition of infrastructure, but we know how to use it in our own homes. And there are very few people in America now who don't have electricity because of affordability. We've seen that rise to the top during the pandemic, but that has been an essential service. I think that we have to work with the regulators to make sure that that's part of the formula and how we grant permits and how we approve applications. I think that has to be there, and there has to be some undergirding of the linkage between affordability and availability for everybody. Just because it's available, you can't afford it. And just because you can't afford it, you may live in an area where it's unavailable. So the two are hand in glove, and we need to speak it up in that way. Thank you, whomever pointed that out. I haven't thought of it in those terms before. And so now it's written down in my notebook on what I need to think about.
And also it's going to require some additional thinking by the Congress. There is a program that's operated under the Federal Communications Commission, the Lifeline program. It's not aggressively implemented. It reaches relatively few people. And in my book, it's not been that successful and probably doesn't have the funding. But what we ought to look about, if you truly believe that digital accessibility, broadband, and mobile devices is critical as water, sewer, many others, then that ought to be just how can we think beyond what we've already been doing? Should that be, for instance, just as we have food stamps or SNAP, should there be digital vouchers in some cases? Should there be further incentives for the provider? Some providers already offer a discounted rate. Is there a way that you meet in the middle and there's assistance provided to the family at the same time they're getting a discounted rate from the provider? But this has to be done on a much larger scale than what's the case. And probably it has to be done outside. I'm not saying abandon, because I don't want that to happen. Abandon what the FCC is doing. I'd like for the FCC to be more aggressive on this. But I also think that in this critical stage, the Congress is also going to have to step in with some additional funding and programming.
Governor Wise, you just kind of brainstormed out loud a couple of different approaches to the solution. Is there one on the list that you favor? Is it a voucher? Is it something else? More concretely, I'm sort of asking, what would be if you were in Congress today, what would be the tangible proposal that you'd be trying to get behind?
The first proposal, what is it that we already have on the books that we can make sure works and possibly expand? And to me, that's the Federal Communications Commission, which already has a universal service fund. It administers E-rate. It goes to schools and hospitals and libraries. And now it needs to make sure it administers and implements the Lifeline, which is designed to reach low-income families. Having said that, it's going to have to come up with additional funds. Now, will it be willing to increase what we all pay on our cell phone bill? That's how the Universal Service Fund is funded. I think that most people, and the poll that you had, Romney, indicates, I think most people would be willing to accept that. I remember when we did an analysis of E-rate a few years ago at the Alliance for Excellent Education, we concluded that I believe you could get 99 and 5 to schools for less than a cup of coffee every month. So that one, that's doable. But then, as I say, my bet is that it's going to take, particularly in this next year or so, with so many people unemployed, it's going to take another initiative by the Congress. And I had not thought through digital vouchers or something, but just as we have TANF, we have HEAP, which is assistance to families, low-income families for our energy assistance. So it seems to me digital access should be fit in there.
I agree 100%, Bob, and I love your brainstorm list. I like the idea of the voucher. I like the idea of a subsidy, and we all know that there are many things subsidized for families who are at risk or kids who are at risk. I don't think we can ever get away from the fact, though, that both availability and affordability coexist together in urban and rural areas. And until we can really admit that there is a role, a must-do role for the federal government, I think, as Bob does, it goes beyond the FCC. I think they don't have the toolkit that's essential to undergird the whole system. I think we've got to also remember the economy. There are hundreds of thousands of small businesses that couldn't survive during this pandemic across the country because they couldn't pay their bills. And one of those big, huge bills was technology. They didn't have access to that phone or to that provider. So it's not just for education, although that's essential. It's an essential educational tool. It's also for job training and for people who have the training who want to continue their small business. It's so essential to the future of all of us. I don't think there should be a discussion. That's why your poll number says we 70% want it. Of course we do. And the other 30% probably would, at least some of them would agree if it were explained. I think that the government needs to pay for it.
I want to pivot the conversation a little bit from Congress to students, because this is about students. I think we've talked about sort of the immediate crisis at hand to stem learning loss as a result of COVID. But there is also a longer term vision that both of you have been part of cultivating and supporting in terms of a future that incorporates hybrid learning for students. So I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on the opportunity of more hybrid models for students, even as we transcend the COVID moment, and also to reflect on the quality issue. What will need to change about the quality in remote instruction as well as teacher preparation when it comes to online instruction? And that's a question, that second piece that we got from the audience that I wanted to make sure we touched on today.
Well, I believe in hybrid learning, but I also have observed, I don't have children in my immediate family, but I have children who have children. And I'm sure that many educators out there who might be on this session have children. And that change that happened to us that we've talked about when the pandemic really insulted the country, and where we very quickly pivoted to digital and to blended and then full digital. None of us really realized the impact it was going to have on families, on people. I believe there's tremendous psychological outcomes that we haven't even envisioned in women and men who've had to do their job and also be the parent and also be the teacher. This whole animal called virtual learning is much more than just learning. It's a whole complex, a whole community of essentials. And I've had to do some real hard thinking about how parents had to be teachers and how teachers had to be both parents and teachers. And so I think there needs to be some realization that remote learning, as I had envisioned, it was all about personalized learning. It was going to be where you had a wonderful teacher in the classroom, and where sometime you went home or sometime you went to the library, but you used a device to access the peripherals or the essential parts of the lesson plan. But it was never 100% in my mind. It was a way to get a PhD online. Maybe that's 100%, but it's not 100% of a kid pre-K through 12. And that's the group that I have focused most on, doing their 24/7 education at home. That was what it was never intended to be. I pray it never becomes that for our kids. I think kids need kids. They need the social and psychological environment called school. It's much more. School has become much more than just a place to go to learn. It's the lifeblood of a community. And I dream of the days we can have some kind of semblance of normalcy in our schools again.
So, Romney, Governor Perdue once again prompted me. Think first, you were talking about what it is that gets the message across. Think for a second what's changed in the last 3 months. 50 million students are out. That means that somewhere around 75 to 100 million adults have been involved in their much more directly, in whether their parents, grandparents, perhaps neighbors, have been involved much more directly in a child's education. They now appreciate, one, much more what a teacher does. Two, definitely want that teacher back. And three, they understand the challenges and weaknesses in a way that they hadn't before. And so this is an incredible, and they also understand this, that hybrid learning is going to be here with us. It was always the opportunity to offer that course that was simply not available in a high school, whether it was a rural school or a historically low resource school. They always understood that in many times in colleges that there's increasing online learning. Now they understand that it's not only something that's for a few, it's going to be with us for all students to some degree. And that so A, it's important to have quality. B, it's important to make sure that our teachers get the support they need to be able to teach in this environment. And so I'm very interested and concerned about, for instance, what it is that our schools of education are going to be able to do to prepare teachers, and also within those teachers that are already in the classroom, what it is that, how it is that we support them develop their community, their communities of practice. They have the high level professional learning or professional development that's necessary to truly be effective in distance learning. When you think of what our teachers have had to do in just the last 3 or 4 months, how they've had to adapt, and then not to, and it's frustrating enough to change your practice and your pedagogy, but then not to have your students with the access that they need. We've got to do a lot. That's one of the things that the Congress has to understand, and that is the importance of a stimulus package, is making sure that our teachers and school leaders and others get the support they need to be able to teach in this still rapidly changing environment.
If I might interject and plug my foundation, that's a nonprofit. If any of you want to help us stand it up in a broader and more substantive context. DigiLearn, one of the real pillars of the whole initiative, has been around training teachers. We have built in North Carolina a core of real digital scholars, is what we call them, where we've trained them in how to be a digital scholar, how to provide the instruction, and how to teach teachers how to be great digital warriors. But we were building it, we never got to scale. And so this has happened, and as Bob said, all these teachers have had to adapt and pivot to become digital scholars. And so I think the ongoing professional training is essential, Bob. I agree so much with what you've said. And I think that the colleges of education, change is never a word that higher post-secondary embraces quickly, but I pray they embrace this change very quickly, because they'll be left behind otherwise in the training of the new type of teacher in our workforce.
I just want to thank Representative Craig Horn from North Carolina. He was the one who sent in that question. And thank you, Representative, for bringing us back to the students. I want to ask one more question about an especially vulnerable population, students with disabilities who struggle to learn virtually. Governors, what advice would you have for state superintendents and others working with students with disabilities to ensure that digital learning is working for them? And as we sort of watch back to school plans unfold, what considerations should leadership have in mind for this population?
I think there's a percentage of the population that it's critically essential that basic services continue to be provided. We've learned with this that there can be great emotional, social, emotional counseling, psychologists, whatever, rehab, whatever the services were that an individual child was receiving prior to the shutdown of schools must continue. Families have been left at risk all over the country, and especially in rural areas with no services. So those kind of basic mental, physical services I'm speaking of first. And then academically, whatever we were doing initially that was working for that child has to be continued. I do not believe that it can be one size fits all when there are special needs kids needing that size.
Romy, what I've had the privilege over the last 2 years at least of working with some really dedicated educators who are involved with students with learning challenges, particularly around dyslexia and reading challenges. And as Governor Perdue says, one size does not fit all, but what is important is, first of all, make sure that, and the Congress can do this, is that it fully funds its commitment to the IDEA legislation, which has never gone fully funded, but if there were ever a time now to do it, it is now. The second then is this will require, as we as we will probably always be in some sort of hybrid learning world, this will also require additional teacher training. And so creating the kind of teacher training institutes, which can be distance and virtual, the teacher training institutes that enable teachers to get the teaching and support they need to be able to deal with these with these populations. And there is, and quite frankly, there is no easy answer here. And but it is important that these students not get just get put to the side, but that we recognize that they're going, as they have had special needs in traditional schooling, there are special needs now. The first step is full funding for what's necessary. Second is what kind of, and I guess there is a third thing. What if there is a benefit to COVID? And if there is a benefit, it is this. It is that 1.5 billion students across the world were out of school at the same time, 66 million teachers. What does that mean? We have a laboratory, a worldwide laboratory to look at of every country and culture and different type of region going through the same thing at the same time. And so what is it that's been working? What is it that is showing to work? What is it that people are exploring? And what kind of research through the science of learning, what kind of research do we need now to be doing to truly be able to advance students in the COVID age? I heard the chancellor of the New York City school system say on a webinar recently, I'm not interested in going back to normal because normal was never good enough. I'm interested in how we improve. And if COVID gives us any opportunity at all, it is to say we've now got, it's not just one state that's had this problem. It's not just one country. We can truly be learning from each other.
I want to come back to, we've talked about Congress, we've talked about schools and educators and the role of professional development. I want to come back to the role of the telecoms in all of this. Two questions. One, if you were on the other side of the table right now from some of those organizations, what would your request to them be? And a question from the audience about transparency. How can we ensure clear communication between public citizens and private companies, which is required for the strong infrastructure needed to keep digital schools and the digital economy going? And that's not just a COVID issue. The pandemic has heightened it, but there are hurricanes and there are other things that, you know, create challenges to access. So first, sort of your request of the private sector, and second, are some reflections on this issue of transparency between the public and companies.
I'll go first, Romney, which is what I've done. Thank you, Bob, for allowing that. And again, thank you to the Hunt Institute for sponsoring this forum. Those are really good, thoughtful questions. I think that the relationship between the providers and the public is a critical piece. You can't do one without the other. We went into it in North Carolina in 2009 with a basic knowledge of the fact that the providers are in the business for profit. And that's a given. And I think the issue of transparency around that profit margin is what the questioner is speaking to. And that must be transparent. There must be total transparency in how the public dollar especially is being invested with the private companies, or vice versa, how the private companies are working to have access to the federal or state grant monies to expand that last or second mile. It's the technology that we have today, not provided with a satellite. I think that will happen very quickly. But the technology that exists today is broadband fiber or some kind of connectivity that you have to lay something down or to build something up. There has to be some physical participation by the telecoms. And they simply haven't done that in areas of low-income communities and really rural and mountainous places. They just haven't done it. They've chosen not to. And I understand that. So we have to leverage what we have, which is the power of the rulemaking, to be sure that we don't threaten, never threaten, just convince and partner with to make it go forward. And then transparency is an issue that I'll go to the mat for. I've believed in it my whole life, long before I got in politics, and I believe in it now.
So let me make that argument sitting across the table, Romy. The argument is this, is half of our children now, almost half of the children in our public school system are low income. And many of them, and then many of those children, whether or not they're low income or not, are living in underserved areas in terms of accessibility. So this is your consumer base, this is your workforce, and incidentally, as every good company knows, yes, you initially make your profit where you go for the low-hanging fruit first. But if you're going to be truly successful, you have to be able to invest in areas that may not bring you the immediate return that you get in a congested area, or a more upper income area, but that over time are truly going to. And if you want to be selling those streaming services that every telecom is now, or I believe most of the major telecoms are involved in, and a number of others, if you want to be selling the streaming services, if you want to be involved in the workforces of the future, it's to your benefit to make this investment. And incidentally, good business is often good politics, and it's also good public relations. And so that, combined with the transparency that Governor Perdue has advanced, I think is the compelling reason. And because the telecoms are smart too, they understand that there's what COVID has done is brought a whole new era of communications to us. And so they need to be there for that, and they need to be, particularly in populations that might not have been subject of attention before, but will become increasingly important.
I want to get one more question in, and I'm going to ask each of you to give a brief answer because we have about 5 minutes left. And it is, what are you hopeful about? What are you inspired by? We've talked about some silver linings in this conversation, and I want to start by saying that I'm very inspired by the parent ingenuity that I'm seeing out there. Parents who are parked in McDonald's parking lots to get access to Wi-Fi. Parents who have 3 kids huddled over one Chromebook and are making it work. I feel inspired by that. That's the message that I bring to all of this, and the rationale as to why we need to be pushing for this. And I'd love to hear what that is for each of you.
So Bev, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bob, please.
No, because, well, so what I'm inspired by is I'm inspired by that. I'm inspired also by the fact that very rarely do we have these opportunities forced by a tragedy or disaster or crisis. Do we have this opportunity to truly move forward and do things differently than we have? I have a belief that I learned in West Virginia a long time ago that when things get really bad, when the ox is in the ditch, people are much more prone to jump in to push it out. And because of the shared experience, Romy, that you just referenced, plus the Congress in some cases coming together around earlier stimulus packages, my hope is that we truly recognize this moment for what it is, take advantage of it, knowing that we can't go back and we have to move forward.
Mine is more personal. I'm inspired, Romy, by the ability, the recognition that we each now have, that we need each other, that it is global and that it's national and that it's the states all coming together as a united people. And we need our teachers. We really need them. People understand the workforce now. We need our parents. The parents have, for the most part, jumped right in. We need our institutions. This has given me, I don't know about all of y'all, but it's given me the time to reflect about the things that I have taken for granted my entire life and how much now I value and appreciate. I appreciate my friends. I appreciate you all. I appreciate technology. I'm thankful for the fact that we have an educational system. It may have flaws, it may have shortcomings, but that essentially works to help us all be better. And that's a constitutional guarantee for many of our states. And so it's all come together for me to be maybe a little bit of a better citizen. You can bet I'm going to register to vote absentee very quickly.
Thank you both so much. What a great note to end on. I want to thank you both for your leadership and the Hunt Institute for all the work that you are doing to support this issue and a variety of important issues for students and families nationally. Thank you so much to the audience as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Romy. And let's see if I can have my Wi-Fi work properly this time. Apologies for the challenges earlier. And Romy, thank you so much for moderating this discussion. Having somebody that can keep up with and leverage the strengths of Governor Wise and Governor Perdue is not easy. So we appreciate you doing so today. And again, thank you so much to both Governor Wise and Governor Perdue for joining us. The Q&A today was one of the most active I've ever seen on these discussions. It was a clear indication that everybody really appreciated it. Sorry we were not able to get to every question today. We will try to get to some more of those via Twitter, so keep a lookout for those using the hashtag that we had referenced earlier. We also have a couple other great webinars coming up. We'd love to have you join. Next Tuesday, we have a discussion with higher education leaders about reopening college campuses. And then on Thursday, we have a discussion about diversifying the teacher workforce in our Race and Education series. We'll be posting a recap of this discussion on our website, as well as a video recording. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to find some answers there. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.